So let's zoom in here. The first thing I'll do is set the typography properly. So I'm going to be using Proxima Nova 21 and 30, I believe it was. Let's double check in our typography stuff. So the H6 is 2130. Yes, 21 representing the font size, 30 representing the line height. And I'm also going to make it bold. And then I'm going to change this arrow because it's just hideous. So let's go ahead and delete that. And I'll open my icon set app, and we're going to pick a nice icon. I'm going to be using the Forge icon set. So let's search for an arrow. Let's see what we can find here. Maybe down. There we go. So I'm going to be using downward. Click, drag, paste it in. And as you can see, this is already inside a frame that has auto layout. I'm just going to use a 16 pixel gap between these two elements. And I'm going to resize the icon using K. And I'm going to make it 32 pixels, like that. Then I'm going to select my parent frame, and I'm going to give it a fill of brand gradient. I'm going to round off its corners, let's say like 100. That's going to create a pill button. And I'm going to add some padding. Because I'm using auto layout, this is super, super simple. So I'm going to be using 24 pixels, top and bottom, 48 pixels, left and right. And this is how I like to make my buttons. Basically, whatever padding I set on the top and bottom, I double it on the left and right. And this creates a nice visual balance. Then with the button selected, as you can see, I'm using the brand gradient as the background, but the other color is black. So I'm gonna actually swap this to white, just like that. Finally, I want to give this button a bit more emphasis. I want it to stand out. So one way I can do that is by adding a shadow, a drop shadow. So I can select the button and I can go to Effects and use the drop shadow from here. I can also click this button and change its properties. But actually, I have a very nice Figma plugin that's called Smooth Shadow, and that basically adds layered shadows to elements. And you can, play around with the different layers here. You can play with the offset, the blur, the alpha, right? And this creates a very, very nice shadow. Personally, I just leave it at default. So let's run that again, Smooth Shadow, and I'm going to apply it. And if we zoom out, you can see that we have a very nice, very subtle shadow applied to that element. So our button is almost complete, but here's a quick tip. Whenever you're designing a button, there are a few things you need to keep in mind to make it usable and to make it look good. First of all, you need to make it look clickable and easy to find. And I do that by using this bright color or colors because I'm using a gradient. So it does look like a button with the rounded edges and stuff. And it's also really easy to find because if we get a bird's eye view of what we've done so far, this button immediately stands out, right? Because it's so colored and because it has a nice size to it. And size is also important. You need to make this button easy to click, but also more importantly, easy to tap on a mobile device because the human finger is a lot bigger than a cursor. So you need to make it large enough to be able to be easily tapped with the finger on a mobile device screen. And finally, you need to tell the user what the button is doing. In my case, I want this button to scroll the page to the portfolio section. So that's why I used this downward arrow and also the text, see my work. And because my work is further down the page, looking at this, the user can, automatically deduce that, hey, if I'm going to click on this button, it's going to take me somewhere down because of the icon. But the wording is also very important. So whenever you're creating buttons, be explicit. Tell the user what that button is doing. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, there are a few more steps we need to take to make sure that our design is ready to be sent to the developer. And when it comes to interactive elements, we must also consider the different states that element can be in. So for example, what happens when I mouse over this button? It needs to change somehow, right? What about when I click it? What about when it's a disabled button? So let's go ahead and cover those things right now. So what I'll do is I'll copy my button. I'll go back to my assets and I'll create a new frame here and I'll paste in that button. So this will be my default state. Then I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to create my hover state. And I think it would be interesting on hover to kind of increase the distance between these two elements, between the text and the icon. So instead of 16, I'll use 24, an 8-pixel increase. Now, this also increases the size of my button, and maybe I don't want that. So I need to take that difference and subtract half of it from each side. So because I'm using 48 pixels of padding, I'm going to say 44 and 44. So now I'll have the exact same size for the button on hover. Of course, we have different sizes here because the text is different. But if I change this to default, you'll see that the width is 267, 267. So I hope that made sense. On hover, we just increase the distance between text and icon, and we deduce that increase from the left and right padding, so the button stays exactly the same size. What about the active, when you click on the button, right? So we have the hover state here. We're going to use that as a template. We're going to call it active state. And when I click it, I want a more visual change, right? So I'm going to select the background, and one thing I can do is decrease the opacity to like 80%. All right, so that's an immediate visual differentiation between when it's hovered and when it's clicked. And finally, when it's disabled, because we might have instances when we need a button to be disabled, I'm going to bring back the opacity to 100%. But instead of this brand gradient, I'm going to choose my primary color. I'm going to give it a solid color. And then I'm going to create a tone for that color, something like that. So something that's more towards gray, maybe even like this. And I think that would work just fine. On top of this, we can also create a secondary style for the button, right? So one that's not as emphasized as the default one. So for that, I'm just going to duplicate this again. I'm going to get rid of the shadows. Remember, we want this to be a bit more subdued. And instead of using a gradient as its background, we're actually going to use a solid white color and use a stroke instead. And we can actually make the stroke the gradient like that. Or we can simply use a primary or a secondary color. Or we can use the black. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So use the black, make this a little bit thicker, and also the text inside should also use black, but I'm going to select black 75. Oops. And that also colored the button, so we don't want that. I just want the text and the icon to have that color. So that's the default state. Let's create a hover state. For the hover, how about we switch things around? How about we add a fill that's using the black color. And for the text, we'll use white. And let's also give this an opacity of about 85%. So I don't want like pure white on a dark background, just tone it down a little bit. Active state is for when you press it down, in which case let's swap the black for black 75. And disabled, how about we do the border black 50, the text black 25, or the fill, and the text, let's make this black 75, or even less than that, black 50, something like that. So that should be a hover state. Pretty easy, right? I think it's an important part of the process of designing a button. You need to consider, okay, this is my button, but I also need to add these various states. But what if I need to add another button in the future that may be not as important as my primary? That's why you create a secondary style. But the secondary style should be more subdued. It shouldn't be as emphasized as the main button. All right, so now it's your turn to design the buttons for your version of the project. Just remember, as I kept saying, take care of those secondary styles for the button and also the different states, hover, active, disabled, and so on. With that said, let's move on to the next pattern on our list, and that is image galleries. I'll see you soon. All right, let's talk about image galleries, and I think the name is pretty self-explanatory. An image gallery is a way of displaying a collection of images while allowing users to see several items at once. It's great for photography websites, but also for online stores, for example, because you can view variations of a product or multiple angles of the same product. And image galleries are also can be linked with a slideshow that allows you to view bigger versions of the same image. And you usually control that slideshow with your mouse or with your keyboard. So let's see some examples of image galleries. Here we are back on the Adidas website, and if we open up one of these categories and we open a product, we can see an image gallery right here. So we can use the controls to view the same product from various angles. I can also use the arrows here. I can click and kind of move around, see a kind of a blown up version of the product. I can also click this bit, and it's gonna show me an even bigger picture, right? So that's one use of an image slideshow. What about this website for GroveMate? Well, this also has an image gallery right here, but it's a little bit different. You simply drag with your mouse, and it's going to show you the images from the slideshow. Pretty cool. You can also click, and that's going to cycle through them. Here's another example. This is for like a real estate website. And if you scroll all the way down, here is a nice gallery with some interesting hover effects. And I can also cycle through these like so. So very nicely done. This is a very, very smooth gallery. Here's another one, right? You have a bunch of pictures here and you simply click on one of them. And then you can move on.